He almost missed her. She was lying on her side in the snow, barely visible in the failing light, her gray dress the same color as the white around her. He was off the horse before it stopped moving. He turned her onto her back. She was breathing barely. Her eyes opened, found his face. I knew you would come. He had ridden 3 days into a blizzard for a woman he had never met. This is the story of why. The letter had been read so many times that the paper had gone soft at the creases, the way old leather goes soft after years of weather and sweat and use. Cole Whitfield stood at the window of his ranch house on the evening of January the 4th, 1884, holding that letter in both hands the way a man holds something he is afraid to put down. Outside, the Colorado high country was buried under 3 weeks of unbroken white. The snow had stopped falling for now, but the sky above the Sangre de Cristo range hung low and gray and full of promise. The kind of promise that means more is coming, whether you want it or not. 3 weeks. That was how long ago Eleanor Hartwell was supposed to have arrived on the Pueblo stagecoach. December 15th was the date she had written in her careful, slightly right-leaning hand. She had been certain of it. There was no hesitation in her words, no hedging, no soft maybe, or Lord willing. Just the date, the route, and one final sentence that Cole had memorized the way a man memorizes a prayer he is not sure he deserves to say. I have come too far in my thinking to turn back now. I will be there. She had not been there. The stagecoach had arrived on the 15th right on time, its wheels cutting through 6 inches of fresh powder on Salita's main street. Cole had been standing outside Crawford's general store before sunrise, collar turned up against the wind, watching the road from the east with an expression that Henry Crawford would later describe to his wife as a man trying not to look like a man who cares too much. The coach had brought 3 passengers, a cattle buyer from Pueblo, a widow visiting her daughter, and a crate of dry goods addressed to the hotel. No Eleanor Hartwell. No young woman with fair hair and blue eyes in a gray-blue pioneer dress that she had mentioned in her second letters, the one where she had been uncharacteristically detailed about her appearance, as if she understood that he was trying to picture her and wanted to help him get it right. He had waited another week before allowing himself to admit he was worried. Then another. Now here he stood reading her words for the 3rd time today, and the cold feeling in his chest had grown from a small thing into something that filled the whole cavity behind his ribs. The ranch house around him was quiet in the way that a house becomes quiet when it has been built for more people than currently live inside it. Cole had put up 3 bedrooms when he broke ground on this place 10 years ago because he had been a young man then, and young men believe in the futures they are building. 2 of those bedrooms had known loss. 1 had known nothing at all. The walls were solid, the floors were level, the stone fireplace in the main room threw good heat. But there was a quality to the silence that even the fire could not fully address. He folded the letter back into its creases and put it in the breast pocket of his blue work shirt close to his chest, then pulled his brown leather vest back into place over it. The vest was worn at both elbows, the leather darkened by years of saddle work in Colorado weather. Maggie had given it to him the Christmas before she died. He had never been able to bring himself to replace it. You are reading that paper again. The voice came from the staircase. Thomas Whitfield, 10 years old, stood on the 3rd step from the bottom with a mathematics textbook open in his hands at a page he had not turned in 3 days. The boy had his father's build and his father's quietness, but he had his mother's hair, a color somewhere between wheat and early morning, and he had her way of noticing things that other people hoped they were hiding. Cole looked at his son for a moment. I was. Tommy came the rest of the way down the stairs and crossed the room to stand beside his father at the window. He did not look up at Cole. He looked out at the same snow that Cole had been staring at for the better part of an hour. The boy's left hand was in his coat pocket, and Cole knew without looking that it was wrapped around the small silver bracelet that lived there. Margaret Whitfield's bracelet, the one she had been wearing when she died of fever in this house 5 years ago, the one Tommy had asked to keep because he said he wanted to have something that still smelled like her. The bracelet no longer smelled like her, but Tommy kept it anyway. You think she is not coming, Tommy said. It was not a question. Cole was quiet for a moment. I think something went wrong. Those are different things. Yes, Cole put his hand on his son's shoulder. They are. Tommy turned that over in silence for a while, the way he turned most things over quietly and at his own pace. Then he said something that Cole did not expect. I do not think she is the kind of person who just stops. Cole looked down at the boy. What makes you say that? Tommy shrugged the carefully casual shrug of a 10-year-old who has an opinion but does not entirely want to be caught having it. The things you read to me, from her letters. She does not talk like somebody who stops. Cole said nothing, but he looked back out at the snow with something new in his expression. It was not quite hope. It was closer to the thing that lives just underneath hope, the thing that makes a man put on his boots before he has decided where he is going. That night, after Tommy had gone to bed, Cole sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, and the letter spread open on the wood in front of him. He had received 11 letters from Eleanor Hartwell over the course of 6 months beginning the previous June, when she had answered the advertisement he had placed in the Boston Courier. He had not expected much from that advertisement. He had written it because Agnes Greer had told him straight that Tommy needed a mother and that Cole was doing no favors to either of them by pretending otherwise. He had written 4 drafts and crossed out the parts that sounded like he was selling something, and what remained was plain enough to embarrass him a little. Ranch in Colorado, 1 son age 10, no debt, not wealthy, looking for a partner, not a servant. Eleanor Hartwell had been the first person to respond. Her first letter was half a page long and contained no flattery whatsoever. She told him what she could not do. She could not cook well, had never ridden a horse, did not know anything about cattle, and was not certain she would enjoy living somewhere with no library within walking distance. Then she told him what she could do. She could sew and mend. She could learn quickly. She was not afraid of work. She had been managing her own affairs since her parents died of influenza in 1881, and she had not yet failed to find a way through any problem that had presented itself to her. Then she wrote a single sentence that had stopped him cold. "I will not promise you a perfect wife, but I will promise you this: I do not quit." He had read that sentence perhaps 50 times in the months since. He was reading it again now in the lamplight, with the Colorado winter pressing against the window panes. He made his decision sometime around midnight. He did not announce it to himself with any particular ceremony. He simply folded the letter, put it back in his pocket, and began thinking about what he would need to pack. Cole Whitfield had learned early in his life that the quality of a decision is not measured by how long it took to make, but by whether it was the right one. He had also learned that the right decision and the easy decision are rarely the same animal. What he was planning to do was not easy, and several people would tell him so before he left. But he knew with the particular certainty that comes from years of trusting his own instincts across hard country that Eleanor Hartwell was out there somewhere in that white expanse to the east, and that she was not out there by choice. And he was the only person in Salida who had reason to go looking. He left Tommy at Agnes Greer's boarding house the following morning before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. Agnes was a woman of 55 who had been running the only boarding house in Salida for 20 years and who expressed her considerable affection for people by telling them difficult truths in a no-nonsense voice before feeding them something warm. She received Cole's request to watch Tommy with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit. "You have never met this woman," Agnes said. "I know her well enough." "You know her letters?" Agnes crossed her arms. "That is not the same thing. It is more than some men know about their wives on their wedding day." Cole picked up Tommy's bag and set it inside the door. "I know what she is made of. The letter showed me that much." Agnes looked at him for a long moment, the way she looked at everything directly and without blinking. Then she said, "The North Pass will be drifted to the eyebrows. The Eastern Trail will not be much better." "I know. You could send word to the railroad depot in Pueblo, ask them to check their records. That would take 3 days minimum. If she has been out in this weather 3 weeks and counting 3 more days matters." Agnes made the sounds she made when she was going to agree with something she found foolish. It was a sound somewhere between a sigh and a word that a preacher's wife was not supposed to say. "Fine, Tommy stays here. You do not get yourself killed." She looked at the boy. "Your father is stubborn. You already know this." Tommy nodded seriously. "Yes, ma'am." Henry Crawford was next. Henry ran the general store, and he was Cole's oldest friend in Salida, a broad-shouldered man with a laugh that could be heard from the street and a generosity that he masked behind complaints about the cost of everything. He was unlocking the front door of Crawford's Mercantile when Cole arrived, and he took one look at Cole's expression and went directly to the back room without being asked, returning with 2 sacks of dried provisions, a sealed bottle of bourbon, and 3 heavy wool blankets. "For the record," Henry said, loading the blankets across Thunder's back alongside Cole's saddlebags, "this is the act of a man who has lost his reason." "Maybe so. She could already be in Pueblo. She could be sitting in a warm hotel room right now writing you a letter about the delay. She could be, Cole agreed. Henry stopped what he was doing and looked at his friend. He had known Cole Whitfield for 12 years, since before Maggie, since before the ranch had a proper house on it, since the days when Cole had been just another young man with a homestead claim and a determination that bordered on the irresponsible. He knew what Cole looked like when he was making a decision that was not really a decision anymore. 2 days, Henry said. If you are not back in 2 days, I am going to Raymond Barton. Give it 3. 2.5, that is my final offer. Before Cole mounted, Tommy appeared at his side. The boy had followed from Agnes's house without being asked, and now he stood in the gray morning cold with his hands in his coat pockets and his face set in an expression of 10-year-old seriousness that Cole found almost unbearable to look at straight on. She did not stop, Tommy said. You are going to find her. Cole crouched down to his son's level. He wanted to say something equal to the gravity of the moment, something worthy of being said in the cold light of a Colorado January, before riding into the kind of weather that had already swallowed Stagecoach's whole. What came out was simpler than he intended. I promised I would, didn't I? Tommy nodded. Then he reached into his left coat pocket and held out his closed fist. When he opened it, the silver bracelet lay in his palm, catching what little light the morning had to offer. Take it, Tommy said. Cole looked at the bracelet and then at his son. Tommy, you need it more than I do tonight. The boy's voice was steady in a way that it had no business being at 10 years old. Bring her back. Cole took the bracelet and closed his fist around it. He could feel the cool weight of it against his palm as he swung up into the saddle as he turned Thunder toward the eastern road. He did not look back at Salida as the town fell away behind him. He did not need to. He carried it with him in the small silver circle of metal in his hand, and in the letter folded against his heart, and in the knowledge that a boy was standing in the cold watching him go, and believing with the absolute faith of the very young that his father would make good on his word. He had not come 100 yards out of town when he saw Wade Forsythe. The encounter had been waiting for him like a stone in the road, and Cole understood this even as it happened. Forsythe was mounted on his big gray at the edge of where the main street became the eastern trail, positioned with the precise casualness of a man who had chosen this spot in advance. He was 45 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a dark mustache kept neat enough to tell you that he spent time on it. His boots were immaculate. They were always immaculate. Cole had noticed that the first time he had ever seen the man 3 years ago, when Forsythe had arrived in the county from somewhere back east with enough money to buy the biggest spread in Chaffee County, and the patience of someone who had been planning this acquisition for a long time. Whitfield. Forsythe's voice was pleasant. It had always been pleasant. Cole had come to distrust the pleasantness the way you come to distrust the quiet before certain kinds of storms. Heading east in this weather, Cole did not stop Thunder. Moving through. The mail-order bride did not arrive, I hear. Forsythe let the word settle. That is a shame. Terrible weather for travel. Terrible weather for a lot of things. He let a moment pass. You know, I was speaking with some men from the county land office recently. Interesting conversation. Your eastern pasture came up. Cole stopped Thunder then, not because he wanted to, but because some things require you to look at them directly before you ride past. He turned in the saddle. Forsythe was watching him with the mild, interested expression of a man reviewing a contract he intends to sign at a time of his own choosing. My eastern pasture has been mine for 10 years, Cole said. Of course. Forsythe nodded agreeably. Of course it has. I just thought you should know that these conversations happen, especially when a man is away from his property for an extended period. He paused. You be safe out there, Whitfield. The mountains do not forgive carelessness. Cole held the man's gaze for 2 full seconds. Then he turned Thunder and rode east without another word. He carried the weight of that exchange with him through the first morning of riding, turning it over in the back of his mind while the front of his mind focused on the trail. The snow reached Thunder's knees in the low spots, and the wind came out of the north with no regard for what it found in its path. By mid-morning, the sky had darkened again, and fine dry snow began to sift down from it, the kind of snow that does not accumulate fast but gets into everything, the collar of your coat, the folds of your blanket, the creases of your face. Cole knew this country well. He had ridden this trail in every season and in every kind of weather the Rocky Mountain winter could manufacture. He knew where the trail tended to drift and where it stayed relatively passable. He knew the landmarks, the notched pine at the base of the first long grade, the frozen creek crossing at mile 8, the rocky outcropping that looked like a sleeping bear if the light hit it right. He marked each one and moved on, pushing east, his eyes sweeping the white expanse on either side of the trail with a methodical patience that he had learned from years of looking for cattle in bad weather and applying it now to something that mattered considerably more. That night, he made camp in a shallow cave in the rock face of a hillside out of the wind, with a fire built from dry branches that burned clean and hot. Thunder stood nearby close enough to benefit from the warmth, his breath pluming steadily in the dark. Cole sat with his back against the stone and drank a single cup of coffee from his trail pack and read the letter one more time by firelight. Not the whole letter, just the last sentence. He did not sleep well, not because of the cold, which was manageable, and not because of discomfort, which he had learned long ago to ignore. He did not sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor Hartwell as he had constructed her from 6 months of correspondence, capable, plain-spoken, unafraid, walking east through the snow, with a small compass in her hand and the absolute conviction that someone on the other end of the trail was worth the effort of getting there. He hoped he was worth the effort. He was back in the saddle before first light. What Eleanor Hartwell had actually been doing while Cole Whitfield read her letters in the cold and built his plan to find her was a thing she would only tell him later, in pieces on the nights when the fire was burning low and Tommy was asleep and the ranch house had that particular quiet that invites honesty. She had left Boston on the 12th of December as planned. The train south had been slow but reliable, and she had arrived in Pueblo on the 14th with a single trunk and the canvas bag she kept with her on the seat. The stagecoach to Salida had been scheduled for the morning of the 15th. She had been on it when it left Pueblo, sitting in the rear-facing seat in her gray-blue pioneer dress with her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it in the composed manner of a woman who has made a long journey and knows how to make a body small for the duration. There had been 5 other passengers, an older man named Walter, quiet and self-contained, who read a Bible and asked no questions. A man called Jacob, middle-aged, a merchant by the look of his clothes, who talked too much about his business until the road got rough, and then he talked too much about the road. 2 women traveling together to visit family in a town east of Salida, and a 5th passenger who had boarded at the last moment in Pueblo, taking the corner seat across from Eleanor, without speaking, without offering a name, without the small, customary acknowledgments that strangers on a long journey usually extend to one another. Eleanor had noticed him the way she noticed most things, quietly, without making it apparent that she was noticing. He was perhaps 30, well-built, with the look of someone who worked outdoors for a living. His hands were calloused. His coat was good quality, but worn in the particular way that work clothes get worn not from age but from use. On the left cuff of his coat, just above the wrist, she caught a glimpse of an embroidered letter, small dark thread on dark fabric. She could not be certain in the dim interior of the coach, but it looked like the letter F. She filed this away without attaching meaning to it. There was no reason to attach meaning to it. Not then. The storm hit on the second day, coming in from the northwest with the speed and seriousness of the mountains at their most uncompromising. The driver fought it for 3 hours before the stagecoach lost the trail entirely in a whiteout, and the lead horse slipped on a sheet of ice beneath the snow. The coach went off the trail at an angle and dropped hard onto a frozen slope. One rear wheel shattered on impact. The coach sat tilted and immovable, half buried by the time the snow let up enough to see. Nobody was killed. Jacob broke his arm and a woman named Mrs. Norris cut her forehead on the window frame. Eleanor had braced herself in the last second before impact and came through without injury. She was the first one out of the tilted door, standing knee-deep in snow, assessing the damage with the matter-of-fact attention of someone whose father had taught her that panic is a luxury and practicality is a skill. Walter had found the trapper's cabin less than a quarter mile through the timber, and they had gotten everyone there through the snow. Eleanor had set Jacob's arm with a straight stick and strips torn from her petticoat, working by firelight, while he tried not to cry out, her hands steady and her instructions calm. She had organized the food. She had divided the blankets equitably. She had done the things that needed doing without waiting to be asked. But she had watched the man from the corner seat the whole time she was doing it. He had helped move Jacob to the cabin. That was fine. He had eaten his share of the provisions without complaint. That was fine. But on the first night, when Eleanor was nearly asleep and the others were breathing in the deep rhythm of exhaustion, She had heard the man speaking low to Mrs. Norris near the door. She had not caught all of it, but she had caught enough. "Which one is the Whitfield woman?" Mrs. Norris had answered with a gesture rather than words, apparently pointing. And the man had looked across the dim space of the cabin to where Eleanor lay still with her eyes half closed. She stayed still for a long time after that, thinking. By morning she had made her decision. It had not been made in fear, though fear was present, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. It had been made in calculation in the clear, unsentimental arithmetic that her father had taught her to apply to problems that did not yield to sentiment. She was the least injured person in the group. The driver had estimated less than 20 miles to Salida. She had a compass. She had her share of provisions. She had two good legs and had been told all her life that she had a stubbornness that put mules to shame. And somewhere to the west was a man who had written her 11 letters over 6 months and had told her in his plain and unadorned way the exact truth about himself and his life and what he was hoping to find in it. She believed those letters. She believed them the way you believe something that does not try to convince you. Cole Whitfield was going to be worried. She knew this the way she knew the other things she knew about him, with a quiet certainty that did not require proof. She slipped out of the cabin in the gray pre-dawn compass in hand and turned her face west. The first 3 hours were manageable. The snow was deep but not treacherous on the open flats, and she could follow the general line of the stage trail by the way the landscape flattened on either side of where the roadbed ran. The compass kept her honest when the trail disappeared entirely. She walked steadily and did not let herself think past the next half mile, which was a technique she had developed during the worst months after her parents died, when surviving the day had required not thinking about the week. Then the wind shifted. It came around from the north and then northwest, pushing snow horizontally across her path, filling her tracks behind her within minutes. The temperature dropped. The compass was still true, but the landmarks she had been using to triangulate her position disappeared behind shifting walls of white. After 4 hours, she was no longer certain she was going west. After 5 hours, her feet had gone from cold to numb to something beyond numb that she did not have a word for. She would not sit down. Sitting down in cold like this was giving up, and she did not give up. She had made that promise in a letter, and she had made it to herself before she ever wrote it to anyone. But her body had its own arithmetic separate from her will, and it had been doing calculations she was not consulted about. When her legs finally gave way, it was not dramatic. She was simply walking, and then she was not walking the way a flame that has run out of fuel does not flicker or die theatrically, but simply stops being. She went down on her side in the snow, and the snow was cold for only a moment, and then it was not cold anymore, which she understood was the most dangerous sign of all, in which she could not make herself care about, because the tiredness had gotten into her bones and was very heavy. She thought about the letters. She thought about the line she had written in the last one, "I will be there." She thought about how she did not quit. And then she thought, "He is coming." She believed this with a completeness that had no logic in it and required none. "He is coming, and I just have to stay here and be findable." She did not close her eyes. Cole Whitfield saw it just before the last of the light left the sky. He had been following the stage trail west for most of the afternoon, moving back towards Salida, from where he had found the abandoned coach and the 4 survivors in the trapper's cabin. He had left them his provisions and his promise to send help, and had turned Thunder into the diminishing light with the kind of focus that has no room for doubt or second-guessing. She had left the cabin sometime yesterday morning. She had 20 hours on him in conditions that would have tired a fit man in half the time. He called her name as he rode, and his voice went out into the white silence and came back to him, changed by the cold, flattened and small. He almost missed her. The gray of her pioneer dress was very close to the gray of the snow in the failing light. She was on her side with her back partly to him, and the snow had dusted the upper part of her coat and her hair with a fine white layer that made her edges uncertain. He would not have seen her at all if Thunder had not turned his head slightly to the right when they passed within 20 feet of her, the instinct of an animal that knows when something alive is present. Cole was off the horse before it stopped moving. He was on his knees in the snow beside her in the next heartbeat, turning her gently onto her back, and his heart was doing something that he had never had a word for, and still did not, a combination of terror and purpose that made every other concern in his life seem very far away. She was breathing. Shallow, slow, but breathing. "Eleanor." Her eyelids moved. Not much, just enough. They opened. The eyes that looked up at him from the white and cold were the exact color of a Colorado summer sky, the color that he had not been able to picture from her letters, and that now seemed to him so specific and so particular to this woman that he could not imagine having pictured it from a description. They were unfocused for a moment, and then they found his face and focused there. Her lips moved. The sound that came out was barely a sound at all, more like a shape of breath. But it was recognizable. I knew you would come. He had always believed himself to be a man of few emotions. Not the absence of feeling, but the management of it, the channeling of it into useful action rather than expression. He had believed this about himself through 10 years of ranching and through the death of his wife and through the long, quiet years of raising a son alone in a house with more rooms than inhabitants. He found kneeling in the snow in the last light of a January day, with this woman's eyes looking up at him, that he had perhaps been partly wrong about this. I am here, he said. Right here, I have you. He wrapped her in both blankets from his pack without waiting to do it gracefully. He lifted her with the care he used for nothing else, the way you lift something you have almost lost before you fully understood its value, and settled her across Thunder's back before him. He gathered her in against his chest and felt through all the layers of winter clothing, the alarming cold of her even against his own warmth. The line shack was less than a mile further west. He had known it was there filed away in the back of his mind from an August cattle drive 3 years ago, a small shelter used by drovers during the summer grazing season. It would be cold inside, but it would be out of the wind, and there would be wood in the stack beside the door if no one had burned it. He found it in the dark by memory and landmarks, and the particular instinct that develops in a man who has spent years learning a piece of country the way you learn a language, not by studying it, but by living inside it. He got a fire going in the small cast-iron stove, with the hands of a man moving faster than he was thinking, packing kindling, striking the match, feeding the first small flames with careful precision. He spread Eleanor's damp outer clothes near the heat. He made coffee from his trail pack and poured it into the tin cup he carried and put it into her hands. He watched her color come back by degrees, a slow tide of warmth moving from the center outward, while the fire grew and the shack lost its worst cold. She was awake and somewhat coherent by the time he judged it safe to stop hovering. Her hands around the cup had steadied from a shake to a tremble, to a stillness that was almost normal. Several of her fingers were white and waxy in a way that he recognized and that would need a doctor's attention as soon as they reached town. But she was talking. She was tracking his face. She was Eleanor Hartwell, and she was alive. He sat down on the rough wooden bunk across from her elbows on his knees and looked at her in the firelight for a moment without speaking. She looked back. It was the first time they had looked directly at each other, the first time the 6 months of paper and ink had a face on it, and the strangeness of this was present in the air between them, along with the wood smoke and the steam from the coffee. You walked away from the cabin, he said, in that weather. I did. No apology in it, no defense, just the fact of it. Why? She looked at the fire for a moment before she answered, and what she said was not what he expected. There was a man on the coach. He never gave his name. And on the first night in the cabin, I heard him ask which one of us was the Whitfield woman. She looked back at Cole. On his coat, there was an embroidered letter. I could not be certain, but I believe it was an F. Cole went very still. The fire popped once in the silence. F, he repeated. I could be wrong about the letter. I was half asleep and the light was bad. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at a point somewhere past the far wall of the shack, and the expression on his face had changed in a way that she could read clearly even at first acquaintance. It was the expression of a man putting two things together that he had been keeping in separate places. Forsyth, the pleasant voice at the edge of town that morning, the conversation about the eastern pasture, the comment about men being away from their property for extended periods. And Eleanor's stagecoach delayed 3 weeks. A wheel that should not have broken the way it broke. He brought himself back to the present with a deliberate effort. This was not the time for it. This was not the place. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered in this small, warm space, and it was sitting across from him, with cold reddened cheeks and blue eyes that held an intelligence he had underestimated, even from her letters which had set a high bar to begin with. You left because your instinct told you to, he said. My instinct and my arithmetic both. Were you afraid? She considered the question seriously, which was one of the things he was already beginning to understand was characteristic of her. She did not give easy answers to real questions. Yes, but not of the weather, she paused. I was more afraid of meeting you than of the storm. He looked at her. Of meeting me. A storm can only kill you, Eleanor Hartwell said, with the calm of someone who has worked this out and is reporting the conclusion. You could make me regret coming. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind pressed at the walls and found no way in. Cole Whitfield was 34 years old and had not said anything about himself to another person that genuinely mattered in 5 years. He was not a man who found this kind of honesty comfortable, but there was something about the woman sitting across from him, the directness of her, the absence of performance in her, that made lying or deflection feel not just wrong but beside the point. I was afraid too, he said. I have been afraid since the 15th of December. Not of the weather either. He looked at his hands for a moment, afraid you would get here and see the place and see me and start calculating whether you had made a mistake. Eleanor looked at him for a long time in the firelight. Your letters had nothing in them that was false, she said at last. I know what I was answering when I wrote back. Something shifted in the room then, not dramatically, just a small and definitive settling, the way a foundation settles when it is properly laid, when the weight it was built for is finally placed on it and everything finds its level. They talked for a long time after that, feeding the fire as it needed, feeding the coffee cups refilled and gone cold and left. They talked about the things that letters leave out, the texture of his days, the sound of the ranch at different seasons, the way Tommy sometimes sat for an hour with a piece of wood and a knife and came out the other side with a small animal that looked exactly like an animal should look. She told him about Boston, the library on Boylston Street, where she had spent most of her free hours since she was 12 years old. The cold winter light through the tall windows, the particular smell of old paper that she suspected she would miss for the rest of her life. She told him about her father's work, the careful record-keeping of a man who believed that paper properly organized was a form of justice. He told her about Maggie, not everything and not all at once, but enough. The way she had laughed, the way she had faced the hard years of early ranching without complaint, the fever that had come on fast and that he had not understood fast enough, and the particular weight of that, the weight that does not lighten with time, but that you learn to carry in a different way. Eleanor listened without trying to remedy any of it. She did not say it was not his fault. She did not say that these things happen. She just listened, which was more useful than either of those things. At some point, the wind outside gentled to something manageable. The fire burned down to coals and Cole fed it again. Tommy's bracelet was in his coat pocket, and he was aware of it there the way you are aware of the things you are holding in trust for someone. Tomorrow they would ride back to Salida. There would be Agnes and Henry and Dr. Price and all the arrangements that come after a rescue. There would be Tommy, who had sent him out with his mother's bracelet and his absolute 10-year-old certainty, and who deserved to know that that certainty had been warranted. There would also, Cole thought, as the firelight played across Eleanor Hartwell's face while she slept on the bunk across from him, be Wade Forsythe, the man with the eastern pasture and the pleasant voice in the letter F embroidered on someone's coat cuff. That was a matter that would need attending to in its time in its proper way. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, there was only the fire and the wind, and the two of them, and the particular silence of a place where something important has just been decided without needing to be said aloud. Cole Whitfield sat with his back against the wall, and his boots near the heat, and the letter in his breast pocket, and the bracelet in his coat, and watched the door and did not sleep because some things are worth staying awake for. Outside, the Colorado winter pressed around the small shelter without getting in. Inside, for the first time in a long time, the house had the right number of people in it. They came into Salida the following afternoon on a sky gone the color of pewter, with the sun somewhere behind the cloud cover, doing its best and not managing much. Cole had Eleanor in front of him on Thunder, her back against his chest, the blanket pulled around her shoulders, against the cold that the morning's riding had not fully defeated. He had his left arm around her and his right hand on the reins, and he held both with the same careful steadiness, the same attention to what was fragile and what was not. He had told her about Forsythe on the ride back. Not everything and not with any particular alarm in his voice, because alarm in your voice solves nothing, and he had learned this from years of delivering bad news to livestock and men alike. He had told her about the morning encounter at the edge of town, the pleasant words about the eastern pasture, the comfortable implication that a man's absence from his property was a matter of some interest to certain parties. And he had told her what the embroidered letter meant and watched her face process this with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything that required thinking. She had not said much after that. She had looked at the trail ahead with the expression of someone filing information in the correct place for later retrieval. Henry Crawford was the first one to reach them, coming out of his store at a half-run, with his coat unbuttoned and his face doing several things at once, relief and relief and relief stacked on top of each other. He grabbed Thunder's bridle and looked up at Cole and then at Eleanor, with the undisguised emotion of a man who has been imagining bad outcomes for 2 days and is now discovering they were wrong. I had 3 different plans for telling Tommy, Henry said. None of them were any good. None of them will be needed, Cole said. Agnes Greer came out of the boarding house at a walk that was almost a run, but had been converted to a walk by pure willpower because Agnes Greer did not run in public unless there was fire. She looked at Eleanor the way a doctor looks at a patient before saying anything quickly and comprehensively, and then she looked at Cole with an expression that conveyed approximately 8 sentences in the time it would have taken to say 2. Then Tommy came around the corner of the boarding house at a full run. He stopped about 10 feet from the horse with the sudden halt of a boy who has been moving on instinct and has run straight into self-consciousness. He stood in the cold street with his hands at his sides, and he looked up at the woman on his father's horse with those serious brown eyes that saw more than they let on. Eleanor Hartwell looked back at him. She had been told about Tommy in letters. She had been told about the quietness and the wood carving and the mathematics textbook that served as camouflage. She had been told about the bracelet, but the letters had not prepared her for the specific quality of Thomas Whitfield's attention, the focused, patient, gathering nature of it, the look of someone building a case. Cole helped her down from the saddle. She was unsteady on her feet but would not take his arm in the first moment, and he had already understood enough about her to let her have that. He reached into his coat pocket and held out his closed hand to Tommy. Tommy opened his palm, and Cole set the bracelet into it. The boy looked at it for a moment, then closed his fingers around it and put it back in his left coat pocket without a word. She steadied herself and then looked down at Tommy from her full height, which was not much more than his, and she did the thing that Cole would remember afterward as the first of many moments when he understood he had not overestimated her. She crouched down, not quickly and not with any ceremony, just brought herself to his level, which cost her something with the cold in her joints, in which she paid without showing it on her face. They were eye to eye in the gray afternoon light. "You are Tommy," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Your father has told me a great deal about you." Tommy received this. "He told me things about you, too, son." A pause. "He read me some of your letters." "Did he?" She did not make it a question. "The ones about Boston." Another pause, more deliberate. "And the one where you said you do not quit." Something moved in Eleanor's expression, subtle enough that only someone paying close attention would have caught it. "That is a true statement," she said. "I want you to know that." Tommy looked at her for a long moment with his full collecting attention. Then he said in the way of a boy who has decided something, "You are wearing a pioneer dress." "I am." "It is wet." "It is," she agreed. "You should go inside." And that for the time being was that. Dr. Samuel Price examined Eleanor in his small office on the east side of Main Street, working with the economical movements of a man who has done this kind of assessment many times and who does not waste motion or words. Cole sat in the waiting area outside and listened to the low murmur of Price's instructions and Eleanor's responses, the steady back and forth of a medical consultation conducted by 2 people who shared a preference for directness. The verdict came through the closed door before Price opened it. 2 weeks, Price said. No unnecessary cold exposure. The fingers and toes need careful attention. There is some surface frostbite that will resolve with proper care but should not be tested. He looked at Cole. "She can stay here." "She will stay with me, thing," Agnes said from behind Cole in a tone that made it clear this had already been decided. Price looked at Cole. Cole looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at no one in particular because she had already moved past this part of the conversation. "The girl stays in my spare room. It is warm and I will see to her properly." She turned to include Cole in her peripheral vision. "You will visit at appropriate hours." Cole did not argue. He looked through the door at Eleanor, who was sitting on the examination table, rewrapping her own hand with the gauze Price had indicated, doing it neatly and without fuss. She caught his eye through the doorway. There was a moment of communication in that look that did not require any of the words that surrounded it. An acknowledgement that something had passed between the two of them in that small shack in the dark, in the cold, something that did not require formalization to be real, but that would benefit from being formalized when the time came. And an agreement reached without discussion that they would let things settle in their proper order. He came to Agnes's boarding house the next morning, and the morning after that, sometimes alone and sometimes with Tommy, who had, by some private arithmetic, decided that the situation warranted monitoring. Tommy would sit in the corner of Agnes's front parlor with a book or a piece of wood he was working on and watch the two adults talk with the alert patience of a boy gathering additional evidence for a verdict he had not yet fully rendered. The conversations built on each other the way conversations do when two people have already covered the formal ground and are now discovering the actual territory. Cole told her about the ranch in the particular detail that he had never put in letters, not because he had been withholding, but because some things require presence to describe the way the light came across the eastern pasture in late October, the quality of the water from the creek that ran along the property's northern edge, the exact configuration of the barn and the two outbuildings and the house with its 3 bedrooms and its good stone fireplace and its wide porch that he had never put furniture on because it had always seemed like the kind of thing you waited to do until you had someone to do it with. Eleanor told him about her father's work, the county court records, and the land filings, and the way a document's legitimacy could be established or questioned by someone who knew what to look at and in what order. She told him about the years after her parents died, the years of the small rented room, and the seamstress work, and the careful management of a budget that left no room for error and not much room for joy. She told him this without self-pity in the way she told him most things as a sequence of facts that had produced a particular outcome, which was sitting here in Agnes Greer's parlor in Colorado in January. On the 5th day of her convalescence, Tommy found her on the boarding house porch in the afternoon sun, wrapped in 2 blankets, and doing mending on a piece of Agnes's household linen because she was incapable of sitting still without useful work in her hands. Tommy came and stood a few feet away, not approaching all the way in the manner of someone who has a thing to do and is working up to the doing of it. Eleanor did not rush him. She kept her hands moving on the linen and let him find his own way in. After perhaps 2 minutes, he took the silver bracelet from his left coat pocket and held it in his open palm, looking down at it rather than at her. "She gave it to me before she died," he said. "My father was not there when she got sick. He was away, and by the time he came back, it had gone too far." He said this with the careful neutrality of a child who has worked very hard to understand something and to hold it without blame. He blames himself. He has always blamed himself. Eleanor set the mending down on her knees. She looked at the bracelet and then at the boy holding it. "Your father told me about her," she said. "He told me she was kind." She was. Tommy closed his fingers around the bracelet, then opened them again. "I have been thinking about something, about why you came." He looked up at her for the first time since he had started talking. "I think maybe she sent you, so that he would stop blaming himself. Because he went looking this time and he found you in time." He said this in the particular tone of a 10-year-old who has worked out a theological point and is not entirely certain of it, but is committed to presenting it. "I cannot prove that, but I think it." Eleanor Hartwell sat with this for a long moment. She was a practical woman, and she was honest about what she knew and did not know, and she did not know whether dead mothers sent help to the living or whether the world was organized in ways that permitted such arrangements. But she knew what the boy in front of her needed, and she knew that the truest thing she could offer him was not reassurance but presence. She moved on the porch bench and left a space beside her. Tommy looked at the space. Then he sat down in it. They sat together in the thin January sun for a long time without speaking, close enough that he could feel the warmth of the blankets, and she could see out of the corner of her eye the way he held the bracelet in his lap with a grip that had changed from something clenched to something open. That evening, Cole came to the porch and found Tommy there, still talking to Eleanor about a book he had been reading about the early mountain men of the Rockies, gesturing with his hands to indicate the scale of certain animals and geographical features. Eleanor was listening with the full attention she gave to things that interested her, asking questions that indicated she had been tracking every word. Cole stood in the doorway without interrupting. He watched his son talk with both hands the way Tommy had talked as a very small boy before he learned the habit of quietness, before the habit of quietness became his natural condition. And he understood, in the way you understand the important things, not as a thought, but as a fact, your body registers before your mind catches up, that something had been given back in this exchange that he had not known how to give himself. He went to bed that night and found that the particular weight he had been carrying in his chest for 5 years had not lifted, but had shifted, redistributed itself across a wider surface so that he could breathe around it differently. The wedding took place 2 weeks after Eleanor's arrival on a Saturday morning in the first week of February in the small white church at the north end of Main Street. Reverend Calvin Mills performed the ceremony with the measured warmth of a man who had married many couples in this territory and who understood that the weight of what was happening did not require embellishment. The women of Salida had made the dress. They had begun it within 2 days of Eleanor's arrival before anyone had asked them to, because in a small town, a story moves faster than a person can tell it, and the story of Cole Whitfield, riding 3 days into a blizzard to find his mail-order bride, had produced in the community a spontaneous act of collective goodwill that manifested itself in cream-colored satin and careful needlework. Eleanor had received the dress from Agnes on the morning of the wedding and had stood holding it for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, not because she was hiding anything, but because she was feeling something she did not have a practiced response for. She had been managing alone for 3 years. Being received was a different thing from managing alone. Tommy stood at his father's left shoulder in his best suit coat with the ring in his right hand held with the focused care of someone who has been given a single important task and is giving it everything. Henry Crawford occupied the front pew with the expression of a man who has decided he is going to cry and is at peace with this decision. Agnes sat beside him with excellent posture and bright eyes, and the look of someone who had arranged many things and was satisfied with the results. When Reverend Mills asked Eleanor if she took Cole Whitfield as her husband, she turned and looked directly at Cole and said yes, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but carried clearly through the small church the voice of a woman who means what she says and knows that she means it. Cole said his yes in the same key. That evening, when Tommy was asleep in his room and the ranch house had settled into its night sounds around them, Eleanor and Cole sat by the fire, and she asked him the question that had been sitting quiet in her since the ceremony. "Tell me honestly," she said, "are you marrying me because you want to, or because you feel that you ought to after riding out to find me?" He looked at the fire for a moment, then he looked at her. "When I placed that advertisement," he said, "I placed it because Agnes told me Tommy needed a mother and she was right. That was the honest reason, and I am not going to tell you otherwise." He paused. "But by the third letter you sent me, I was reading your mail before Tommy's. By the fifth letter, I was reading them twice. And by the time the 15th of December came and went, with no coach, what I felt was not concern for Tommy's welfare." He held her gaze. "I can tell you the difference between those two things because I know what both of them feel like." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That answer is honest enough to trust." "I try to be." "I know. I could tell from the letters." She looked at the fire. "I'm going to tell you something that I should say out loud. I have managed alone long enough that I may not always know how to let someone else carry half the weight. I will not pretend otherwise when I do not know how, but I will always tell you which it is." She glanced at him. "That is not a warning, it is information." "I know the difference." "I thought you might." She looked back at the fire. "I am going to need to learn a great many things. I'm going to make mistakes. I want you to tell me when I do." "All right, and I will tell you the same." "I expect you will," Cole said. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that he was already beginning to recognize as the restrained version of something larger. He filed this away as one of the things he intended to spend considerable time learning to read. They sat with the fire until it burned down to deep coals, not needing to fill the quiet, which was itself a kind of information about the two of them. The trouble announced itself on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the wedding, when Miguel Diaz, who worked Cole's cattle, and who had the particular manner of a man with difficult news he has been sitting on longer than is comfortable, peered at the barn door, while Cole was doing the morning feeding, and said he needed a word. The word was Wade Forsyth. While Cole had been riding east, and while the wedding had been occupying the town's attention, Forsyth had filed a legal claim at the Chaffee County Land Office. The claim covered 300 acres of Cole's eastern pasture, the open grazing land along the creek bottom that represented roughly one-third of the ranch's workable acreage. The basis of the claim was a handwritten document dated 1879 bearing the signature of a county land officer named Simmons, who had retired to Santa Fe the previous year. Cole read the copy that Miguel had obtained from the county office with the still face of a man absorbing information he has not fully processed yet. Then he read it again. 300 acres. One-third of his operation. Without that pasture, the summer grazing capacity dropped by half, and the herd would need to be culled accordingly. The ranch would not fail immediately, but the financial slope it would put him on would steepen every year thereafter, and Forsyth, who did not appear to be short of patience, would simply wait at the bottom of it. He went to Raymond Barton that afternoon. Barton was a careful man and a fair one, and he read both documents, Cole's original deed from 1873 and Forsyth's 1879 claim, with the unhurried attention of someone who has been settling land disputes in this territory long enough to know where the relevant details tend to hide. "Your deed is older and it is clean," Barton said. "That gives you a strong position." He set the papers down, but Forsyth filed through the county office, and it has been entered into the official record. The presiding judge on this circuit right now is Judge Allen, who came up from Denver 6 months ago and does not know this county or its history. Barton looked at Cole with the directness of a man who respects the person he is giving bad news to. "You need a lawyer, Cole. The nearest one worth having is in Pueblo. 3 days ride in good conditions, more in this weather." "I know. And the filing has a response deadline. 14 days from the date of filing." Barton picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. "I am going to be honest with you. Forsyth chose his timing." Cole rode home in the cold afternoon and told Eleanor what Barton had said with the same plain economy he used for most things that required courage to say. She listened without interrupting, and when he had finished, she was quiet for a moment, with the focused stillness she had when she was thinking rather than when she was waiting. Then she said, "Show me both documents." Cole spread them on the kitchen table. Eleanor sat down and read Forsyth's claim with her full attention, moving through it slowly, then going back and reading certain sections again. She had the habit of her father's profession without having the profession itself the habit of looking at a document not for what it said first, but for what it assumed for the framework behind the words that the words were resting on. She found it on the second rating. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the header block of Forsyth's 1879 document. "This form, the numbered sections here, the way the land description fields are laid out. My father worked with these forms." She looked up at Cole. "This format was not adopted by Chaffee County until 1881. I'm nearly certain of it. The county updated their standard land filing forms in that year. Before that, they used an older format inherited from the territorial period." Cole looked at the document and then at her. "You are sure?" "I am sure enough to check. The land office keeps its own records of procedural changes. If I can obtain the reference documents for 1879 versus 1881, the comparison will be clear." She looked at the filing again. "Forsyth is careful, but he used a form that did not exist yet on the date he claims this document was signed. Either he filed it recently and backdated it, or it was prepared by someone who did not notice the discrepancy. How do you get access to those reference documents without alerting Forsyth's people?" Eleanor thought about this. "I tell the clerk I am doing research for a piece about the history of land settlement in the county for a church publication. Women doing historical research do not attract particular suspicion. Men going through legal records do." Cole looked at her for a moment. 3 years of managing my own paperwork, and 2 years of working for a judge's household before that," she said, answering the unasked question. "I know what these documents look like." She spent the following 2 days in the county records office, working steadily through the reference materials, with the patience of someone who has been trained to find things in organized collections of paper. She returned each evening to the ranch with notes in her precise handwriting, building the case piece by piece, the way her father had built cases, not with argument, but with documented fact. On the third day, she came home at mid-afternoon with her coat still on and sat down at the kitchen table and spread her notes in front of Cole without a word of preamble. 3 discrepancies, she said. The form header, which was not in use in 1879. The notarization format, which changed in early 1880. And a land parcel reference number in the body of the document that corresponds to a county filing system that was not implemented until 1882. She looked up at him. Any one of these could be explained away. All three together cannot be. This document was not signed in 1879. It was prepared sometime after 1882, and the date was filled in afterward. Cole read through her notes carefully. He had not doubted her, but reading the evidence assembled and organized in her hand made him understand with new clarity the particular quality of the mind he had married. "You can present this," he said. "I can present it clearly enough that Judge Allen will understand it even without prior knowledge of local procedures," she said. "I would like to speak to Barton first. He should be in the room when we go before the judge." They went before Judge Allen on a Thursday morning with Barton standing against the wall to Cole's left, and Henry Crawford in the gallery behind them, and Forsythe across the room with his lawyer from Denver, a man in a three-piece suit who had the practiced ease of someone accustomed to winning in unfamiliar courtrooms. Eleanor sat beside Cole and said nothing, while Forsythe's lawyer presented the 1879 claim with confident fluency, citing precedent and county law and the legal weight of registered documents, building his argument the way an architect builds a structure he intends to stand in. Then Eleanor Hartwell placed on the table in front of Judge Allen a single handwritten page. She explained what it contained in language that was clear and sequential and required no legal training to follow. She explained the form header, the notarization format, and the parcel reference number, and she explained the timeline that made all three of them impossible if the document was what it claimed to be. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. Judge Allen looked at the page. He looked at the original documents. He looked at Forsythe's lawyer, who was looking at the paper with an expression that had slipped considerably from its earlier confidence. "Mr. Forsythe," Allen said, "this appears to be a substantial problem with your filing." Forsythe sat very still in his chair. His face had not moved. He was a man who had built a considerable life on the discipline of not showing what he was thinking, and the discipline held now at least on the surface. The claim was dismissed. Outside the courthouse on the wooden steps in the February cold, Cole stood beside Eleanor and said nothing for a moment. Forsythe came out a minute later, buttoning his coat, his lawyer behind him. He stopped when he reached Cole and Eleanor, not because he had to, but because he chose to, because he was the kind of man who made every encounter a choice between the options available to him. He did not look at Cole. He looked at Eleanor with the measuring attention he had previously reserved for property assessments. "The Whitfield woman," he said, not unkindly, informatively, as though cataloging. Eleanor met his gaze without any change in her expression. Forsythe held the look for 2 seconds. Then he nodded once in the fractional way of a man acknowledging a shift in the balance of a contest and walked past them down the steps. On the ride home, Henry Crawford, who had ridden out with them and was now riding beside Cole with the expression of a man who had witnessed something he intended to retell for years, said, "Where did she learn to do that?" "Her father," Cole said. "Her father was remarkable. She is the one who did it." Henry looked across at Eleanor, who was riding slightly ahead of them, and appeared to be thinking about something. "Yes," he said, "she is." That evening in the kitchen of the ranch house, after Tommy had gone to bed and the dishes were cleared, Cole set a cup of coffee in front of Eleanor and sat down across from her. He looked at her for a moment. "I told you I would tell you when you made a mistake," he said. She looked up. "Did I make one?" "No, I am telling you this because I want to be clear about the other side of that arrangement." He paused. "Today was not a small thing, what you did in that room." "It was logic and documentation," Eleanor said. "Those things applied at the right moment with the right courage are not small." He held her gaze. "I want you to know I understand the difference." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father told you to say that, or you worked it out yourself?" "My father did not say much," Cole said. "I had to work most things out." "Good," Eleanor said. "The ones you work out yourself tend to stay." She picked up her coffee cup. "For what it is worth, I want to be very clear about something. I did not come here to manage your affairs. I came here to be your partner. Today was the same thing." "I know," Cole said. "I wanted to be sure you knew." "Eleanor." "Yes, I know." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "All right, then." The trouble with Forsythe did not end with the dismissed land claim. A man like Wade Forsythe did not build what he had built by abandoning a line of effort because the first approach had failed. He abandoned approaches, He kept the objective. The second approach arrived in a letter. It came 3 weeks after the courthouse in a march that had begun to show the first tentative signs that Colorado intended to eventually permit spring. The letter had a Boston postmark and a return address that Cole recognized from something Maggie had mentioned years ago in a way that had made him understand it was not a memory she treasured. Harriet Colby, Maggie's mother. He read it at the kitchen table with the same still face he had worn when Miguel had brought him the news about the land claim. Then he set it down. Eleanor, who had been working on accounts at the other end of the table, looked up at his face and read it before he said a word. She had become, in 6 weeks of marriage, quite good at reading Cole Whitfield's face, which was not an easy text. What she read now was the specific quality of stillness that meant the thing he had just encountered was in a different category from the things he usually handled. She held out her hand for the letter. He gave it to her. Harriet Colby was a widow of means living in a Boston townhouse on a street that indicated inherited money carefully managed. She had opposed Maggie's marriage to Cole Whitfield from the beginning and had maintained her opposition by way of near-total silence through the years of the marriage and through Maggie's death and through Tommy's childhood, her absence so complete and so deliberate that Tommy barely knew her name. Now, with a precision that told Cole everything he needed to know about the source of her sudden interest, she had engaged a Denver lawyer to file for guardianship of Thomas Whitfield on the grounds that his father's remarriage represented an unstable domestic environment and that the boy would be better served by the advantages that a woman of means in a city of culture could provide. Attached to the letter was a notarized document on legal paper from a Boston court bearing the name Eleanor Hartwell, alleging breach of contract in a commercial dispute from 1882. Eleanor read the guardianship letter once. Then she read the attached document twice. Then she set both papers down on the table with the deliberate placement of someone who is managing a careful response to a significant provocation. The guardianship filing is Forsyth, she said, not a question. He knows Harriet Colby had standing to file. He knew she resented the marriage and never acknowledged Tommy in 5 years. Cole's voice was level, but had a quality beneath the level that was not level. He gave her a reason and a lawyer. And this, Eleanor put her finger on the attached court document. This is not real. Cole looked at it again. How do you know? The judge named in the signature block died in 1880. I know this because he was a colleague of my father's and I attended his funeral. She looked at Cole steadily. Whoever prepared this document used a name from the public record and did not check whether that person was still living. Cole looked at the document for a moment. Can you prove that? With a letter to the Boston Court of Common Pleas and approximately 2 weeks for the reply. She folded her hands on the table. We have a hearing date. The letter gives us 30 days. Then we have time. She looked at the guardianship filing again and at the court document, and then she looked at the wall beyond them, at the place where the kitchen wall met the ceiling, the particular place people look when they are thinking about something difficult that they are not going to avoid. I need to tell you something, she said. What about the legal situation? Cole waited. I have been here 6 weeks, Eleanor said. I know that is not long. I know Tommy is still deciding about me, and I know that I am still learning what this place requires. She looked at him directly. But I want you to know that this is my home, not because of the legal arrangement between us, because I decided it is. And I am going to fight for it the way I fight for the things that are mine. Cole looked at her for a long time. I know that, he said. I wanted to say it out loud. I know that too. Tommy heard them that night, not because he was trying to. He had woken sometime after midnight and gone to get water from the kitchen, a habit of his since he was small, and the low voices from the main room had reached him through the hallway door before he was fully awake enough to identify them as private. He stood in the dark hallway and caught fragments. His name, the name Colby, which he connected dimly to something he had heard once from Maggie's friend about the grandmother who never came to visit, and the words Denver lawyer and filing and guardianship, the last of which he did not know, but which sounded in the tone it was spoken like something serious. He went back to his room without his water and lay on his bed in the dark. He was 10 years old, and he was not the kind of child who could put adult legal proceedings into their proper context, but he was also not the kind of child who could hear a conversation about himself and not understand the emotional weight of it. Someone wanted to take him somewhere that was not here. In the morning, he found Eleanor at the kitchen table before his father was up. She was writing something in her careful hand, and she looked up when he came in and set down her pen without being asked. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "Mrs. Colby wants to take me to Boston." Eleanor looked at him without surprise at the directness of it. She had been expecting this conversation since the night before. "She wants to," Eleanor said. "Your father and I are not going to let that happen." "Why does she want to now? She never wanted me before." This was the hardest question, and Eleanor answered it without flinching, because Tommy deserved the honest answer more than the easy one. Because someone told her it would bother your father. Some people want things not because the thing itself has value to them, but because getting it takes it away from someone else. Tommy absorbed this with his characteristic stillness. Then does she have the legal right? She is trying to establish one. She does not have it yet. Can she get it? Not if I can help it. Eleanor met his eyes, and I am very good at helping it. Tommy looked at her for a long moment. He was doing the thing he did, the collecting, the assessing. Then he said very quietly, as if testing the words before committing to them, "This is my home." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." "Then it stays my home." "Yes." He nodded once in the compact, decisive way that was entirely his father's and went to the sink to pour his water. Then he sat down at the table across from Eleanor and said, without looking up from his cup, "Will you tell me what you need to do for the legal part? I want to understand it." Eleanor looked at this boy for a moment, at the serious set of his shoulders, and the careful way he held his cup, and the brown eyes that were already looking at her with a readiness that she had not yet earned, and that he was offering anyway provisionally, the way you offer trust to someone you have decided to believe in before the evidence is complete. She picked up her pen. "I will start from the beginning," she said. Outside the kitchen window, the March light was beginning to find its way through the cloud cover, thin and tentative, but undeniably present, falling across the snow on the eastern pasture, the pasture that was still theirs, and casting the first long shadows of what would eventually be spring. There was still a hearing to get through. There was still a man in a house on the far edge of the county who had not stopped thinking about what he had started. There were still letters to write and evidence to gather and a courtroom to face with a judge who did not know them and a lawyer who did not care about them and a case that would require everything she had learned and everything she was prepared to do. But there was also a boy sitting across the table from her, asking to understand, and the light coming in from the east and the sound of Cole's boots on the floor upstairs as he began the morning. Eleanor Hartwell Whitfield wrote down the first point of the legal response in her clear and careful hand, and she did not look up from the page, and she did not quit. The letter from Roy Aldous did not come in an envelope. It came folded inside a copy of the Pueblo Chieftain that Henry Crawford found propped against the back door of his store on a Wednesday morning in late March, 3 days before the guardianship hearing was scheduled to be heard by Judge Allen. Henry recognized the name on the inside fold because Cole had mentioned it once briefly in the context of the man on the stagecoach who had never given a name. He walked the paper to the ranch himself rather than sending it, which told Cole everything he needed to know about how Henry had read its contents. Roy Aldous had worked for Wade Forsythe for 2 years. He was not a bad man in the way that men who choose evil as a philosophy are bad. He was a man who had made a series of incremental accommodations with the wrong employer, each one small enough to justify at the time and each one making the next one easier, until he found himself standing in a barn in Pueblo on the 14th of December, 1883, mixing the wrong substance into the wheel grease of a stagecoach scheduled to depart the following morning. He had not known how many people would be on that coach. He had not known how bad the weather would get. He had been told it would delay the coach, cause a breakdown somewhere on the eastern Colorado high country, hold things up long enough for certain other arrangements to be completed. He had been told this in writing in a note on Forsythe's personal stationery, because Forsythe trusted no one to execute his instructions correctly without documentation, a habit of meticulous record-keeping that had served him well across a long career of getting other men to do things he preferred not to do himself. Roy Aldous had kept the note. He had kept it the way men keep things that scare them, tucked away in the bottom of a saddlebag and not examined too closely, a kind of insurance that he had never expected to actually use. What had changed his calculation was not courage exactly, or not only courage. It was that he had seen Eleanor Whitfield in the courthouse 3 weeks ago sitting beside Cole at the table with her handwritten page of legal discrepancies and he had understood clearly, and for the first time, the full weight of what had been risked on that stage road. A woman had nearly died. A boy had nearly been left without a father. And the man who had arranged it was now attempting to use the legal system to take the boy away from the home that had nearly cost his stepmother her life to reach. Roy Aldous had limits after all. He had just taken some time to find them. The note was folded inside the newspaper, written in a hand that shook slightly at the beginning of each line and steadied as it continued. It described the instruction Forsyth had given, the date, the method, and the payment. It described where the original instruction note was hidden in the lining of a saddlebag currently stored in Forsyth's tack room. Aldous did not offer to appear in person. He made no promises about what he would say under oath if it came to that. He said only that he had children of his own and that he had decided he could not continue to say nothing. Cole read it at the kitchen table with Henry sitting across from him and Eleanor standing at the window with her back to the room, which was her habit when she was thinking hardest. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Henry. "He is not offering to testify," Cole said. "No," Henry agreed. "This alone is not court evidence. It tells you where the original note is," Eleanor said without turning from the window. Both men looked at her. She turned around. "Forsyth's tack room. If Raymond Barton had cause to look there." She paused. "If someone provided him with sworn information sufficient to establish probable cause." Cole looked at the letter from Aldous again. "Aldous will not swear to anything. He said as much. He said he would not appear in person. He did not say he would not sign a sworn statement provided to him at a location of his choosing." Eleanor came to the table and sat down. "A signed affidavit from Roy Aldous describing what he did and where the original instruction exists would give Barton his cause." She looked at Cole. "Where is Aldous now?" "He does not say in the letter." "Henry," Eleanor looked across the table, "you received this at your store. Was there anything with it that might indicate how it was delivered? Anyone seen near the back of the building?" Henry thought for a moment. "My boy said he saw someone by the creek at the back of the lot before dawn. Described him as a working man, medium height, on foot." "Then he is in Salida or near it," Eleanor said, "and he came to you rather than to Cole or to Barton, which means he is uncertain how far Forsyth's reach extends into the official structure of this town." She looked at Cole. "He trusts a civilian intermediary more than an official one. That makes sense given what he has told us about Deputy Oakes." Cole had not told her about Oakes directly, but she had observed enough in 6 weeks to draw her own conclusions about the deputy's relationship with Forsyth, and her conclusions were accurate. He had stopped being surprised by this. "I know where men like Aldous go when they are uncertain and nearby," Henry said. He stood up. "Give me 2 hours." He was back in one. Roy Aldous was in a room above the feed store on the south end of Main Street, paying in cash, and he had signed in the affidavit within 20 minutes of Henry Crawford sitting down across from him and explaining in Henry's plain and reasonable way exactly what the situation was and what a single honest action could accomplish within it. Cole took the affidavit to Raymond Barton that afternoon. Barton read it twice, looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man doing a calculation that involves professional risk, and then stood up and put on his coat. "I am going to need a deputy who is not Frank Oakes for this particular search," Barton said. "I would suggest Billy Marsh," Cole said. Billy Marsh was 19 years old and had been Barton's second deputy for 8 months and had not yet developed any inconvenient loyalties beyond the law and the sheriff's office. "Billy Marsh it is." They found the original instruction note exactly where Aldous had described it, sewn into the lining of a saddlebag on the third hook from the left in Forsyth's tack room, entered through a warrant that Judge Allen signed at 6 that evening, with the measured reluctance of a man who is beginning to understand that the county he has been assigned to is more complicated than his briefing suggested. Barton brought Frank Oakes into his office the following morning and put the note on the desk between them, and said nothing, which was frequently the most efficient method available to a man with the truth on his side. Oakes resigned before noon. He left Salida by the eastern road that afternoon, which was the road that led eventually to Pueblo, and then beyond to the places where a man could start over if he had the appetite for it. The night before the hearing, Cole sat in the main room of the ranch house with the fire burning, and Tommy asleep upstairs, and Eleanor at the kitchen table writing her final notes for the morning. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet now, which was different from the way it had been quiet before Eleanor arrived. The before quiet had been the quiet of insufficient people in a space that had been built for more. The now quiet was the quiet of rest of a day done and a household in its proper order, the quiet that is the background noise of a life being lived rather than merely endured. He sat for a long time without reading or doing anything in particular, which was not his usual nature but which he had been permitting himself more often in the recent weeks. He was thinking about Forsyth and the hearing, and the note from Aldous, and the sequence of events that had begun with a stagecoach wheel and ended here the evening before a courtroom that would settle something important. He was also thinking about the fact that none of it would have reached this point without Eleanor Hartwell sitting at that kitchen table. She came through to the main room at some point and sat in the chair across from him without a book or her papers, which meant she was done for the night and had come to sit rather than to work. They had developed in 6 weeks a considerable number of practices that had arrived without being discussed or named, and this was one of them the hour before bed when neither of them required anything of the other except to be in the same room. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," she said without qualification. He believed her completely. He had learned that Eleanor did not say yes to things she was not ready for. She said not yet, or she said what she still needed, or she said nothing and went away and prepared herself and came back when she was ready. She did not perform readiness as a reassurance to others. When she said yes, it was a statement of fact. "Tommy knows what is happening tomorrow," Cole said. "I told him this evening." "I know. He came to talk to me afterward." She was looking at the fire. He wanted to know what he should say if they asked him a question in the hearing. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to say the true thing, whatever it was, and not to worry about what anybody needed to hear." She paused. "I told him that the truth spoken plainly has a weight that nothing else has. That people can argue with a position, but they cannot argue with a plain fact delivered without performance." Cole thought about this. "Your father taught you that." "My father taught me that by example rather than by instruction. He was not a man who talked much about his methods." She glanced at Cole. "I find that is frequently how the useful things are transmitted." In the morning they rode to the courthouse together, the three of them, Cole and Eleanor and Tommy, on horses in the thin March light, the snow still present in the shaded places, but retreating from the open ground the first hint of what the land would become in another month, present in the way the air moved, which was less like a wall and more like a door. Forsyth's Denver lawyer was already in the courtroom when they arrived, arranged behind his table with papers sorted, in the particular ease of a man who has appeared in unfamiliar courtrooms many times and has learned that confidence is its own kind of argument. He was good. Cole could see that immediately. He was the kind of lawyer who made the complexity work for him, who could take a simple situation and surround it with enough procedural structure that the simple truth at the center became difficult to see. Harriet Colby had not come from Boston. She had sent her lawyer and her documentation and her name, which was sufficient for her purposes. Judge Allen entered, arranged himself behind the bench, and called the proceeding to order, with the brisk manner of a man who has a full docket and intends to move through it efficiently. The lawyer from Denver went first. He was 40 minutes of careful, fluent work. He established Harriet Colby's standing as Thomas Whitfield's sole surviving maternal relative. He noted the circumstances of Maggie Whitfield's death and the years that had followed it, years during which he argued Cole Whitfield had done his best under difficult conditions, but had not provided the kind of stable, resourced environment that a boy of Tommy's quality deserved. He raised with measured delicacy the recent legal uncertainties surrounding the ranch, the land claim filing, and the questions of property stability. He raised with equal delicacy the question of Eleanor Whitfield's background and history in Boston, noting the attached court document and suggesting that a woman whose past was not fully verified was perhaps not the ideal maternal figure for a child already navigating instability. He was measured throughout. He was never unkind in a way that could be called unkind. He was simply building a structure brick by brick that looked from a certain angle like the responsible concern of a family member for a child's welfare, and that was in fact the architecture of a campaign that had been designed by a man sitting in a large house on the eastern edge of Chaffee County who had already lost 2 direct approaches and was executing his third. Then Raymond Barton stood up. He did not speak like a lawyer, he had never gone to law school, and he did not pretend to the cadences of the courtroom. He spoke like a man who has been sheriff of a county for 20 years and who has a piece of evidence in his hand that he would like the court to examine. He placed Forsyth's original instruction note on the bench in front of Judge Allen. He explained where it had been found, under what warrant, through what chain of information. He explained what it said. He explained that the man who had received this instruction and carried it out had provided a sworn affidavit, which was the second document he placed before the judge. He explained that the result of the action described in those documents was a stagecoach breakdown on the eastern Colorado high country in December of 1883, which had resulted in one passenger with a broken arm, one with a head laceration, and one the woman now known as Eleanor Whitfield, who had suffered frostbite and near-fatal exposure to cold while attempting to seek help for her fellow passengers. He explained that the person who had issued the original instruction and who had subsequently filed the land claim against the Whitfield Ranch and who had subsequently provided Harriet Colby with both legal representation and a false court document from Boston was Wade Forsyth of Chaffee County, who was present in this courtroom. The room was very quiet. Judge Allen looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at Forsyth's lawyer, who was looking at the documents with an expression that had moved well past its earlier confidence and arrived somewhere considerably less comfortable. He looked at Forsyth, who was sitting in the gallery with the stillness of a man whose discipline is being tested at its absolute limit. Allen looked at Cole, at Eleanor, at Tommy, sitting between them. Before I address the matter of the guardianship petition, he said, I would like to hear from the child. Tommy stood up. He was 10 years old and he was wearing his best coat and his boots were clean and he stood at his full height, which was not much, but which he used completely, and he looked at Judge Allen with his father's directness and his own considered calm. Thomas, Allen said, you understand that the court is trying to determine what is in your best interest. I want to hear from you directly. Where do you want to live? Tommy said, I want to stay with my father and with Mrs. Whitfield. Allen said, can you tell me why the Tommy was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he was choosing his words with the care of someone who has thought about this and wants to say it correctly the first time. Mrs. Whitfield is not my mother, he said. I know that. She knows that. My mother died and she is not coming back, and nobody is going to replace her. He paused. But Mrs. Whitfield chose to come here. She could have stayed in Boston. She had a life there. She chose this instead. He paused again. And then she could have gone back. She had reason to go back. She chose to stay instead. He looked at Allen steadily. Think a person who keeps choosing the same thing is telling you something true about what they want. Mrs. Colby never chose us. She never came. Not once in 5 years. He stopped. That is all I have to say. The room was quiet for a moment after this, in the way that rooms are sometimes quiet after someone has said something that is plainly and simply true, and that does not require addition or commentary. Judge Allen looked at Tommy for a moment. Then he looked at his papers. Then he said, the petition for guardianship filed by Harriet Colby is denied. Thomas Whitfield will remain in the custody of his father, Cole Whitfield. He set down his pen. As to the matter of Mr. Forsyth, Sheriff Barton, I believe we will need a separate proceeding. Barton nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Forsyth did not move in the gallery. His face had not changed. He was a man of exceptional discipline, and the discipline held, even now, even here, because it had been so long the primary instrument of his survival that it had become indistinguishable from his actual nature. But the room had shifted around him in a way that could not be shifted back, and he knew this, and the knowledge was in the quality of his stillness, the way cold is in the quality of certain kinds of silence. On the courthouse steps afterward, in the thin warm light of a March afternoon that was making its best effort at spring, Tommy walked out between Cole and Eleanor, and then without a word or a signal from anyone moved to Eleanor's left side and put his hand in hers. Not a child's grab, not the reflexive contact of a boy needing steadying, a deliberate, considered placing of his hand in hers, the hand of a 10-year-old choosing something in a way that required no interpretation. Eleanor looked down at him. She did not speak. She held his hand. Cole looked at both of them. He looked for a moment too long, and then he looked away at the mountains to the west, which were doing what they always did, standing there in their massive indifference to the small human things happening at their feet. And he understood, in a way that he could not have articulated and did not try to, that what he was looking at over his shoulder was the full weight of what he had ridden into the blizzard for, and that it was larger than he had known how to want when he wanted it. Forsyth came out of the courthouse 5 minutes later with his lawyer and without expression and walked past them on the steps as he had walked past them once before and stopped as he had stopped before and looked at Eleanor again with the same cataloging attention. Cole stepped forward, slightly, not dramatically, just enough to be in the man's direct line. Forsyth looked at him. Then he said quietly so that only Cole could hear it clearly, "Your ranch, Whitfield, your family." A very small pause. "You hold them well." It was the closest thing to acknowledgement that a man like Forsyth was capable of, and Cole understood it as such without accepting it as anything more than what it was, the inventory of a man recording a loss before moving on to the next account. "I intend to," Cole said. Forsyth walked down the steps and did not look back. Barton, who had been standing nearby with his thumbs in his belt, in the manner of a man who has accomplished what he came to accomplish, stepped up beside Cole after Forsyth had gone. "He will have lawyers in front of him for some time. Whatever happens with the legal proceedings, his standing in this county is done." He looked at the street where Forsyth had disappeared. "A man like that runs on reputation the way a mill runs on water. Dry the source and you have already won most of the battle." Cole nodded. "Your wife," Barton said, and stopped, started again. "What she did with those documents, the land claim and the court document from Boston." He shook his head slightly in the way of someone encountering a quality he had underestimated. "Tell her from me that if she ever needs a position in this county, I will make one." Cole found Eleanor at the bottom of the steps with Tommy. "Raymond Barton says if you want a job in the county, you have one." Eleanor looked up at the courthouse. "Tell him I already have a job," she said. "I am running half of a cattle ranch." She was not wrong about this. In the weeks since the wedding, she had taken on the bookkeeping for the operation with a thoroughness that had immediately identified 3 places where costs were being absorbed unnecessarily, and 1 place where the accounting system Cole had been using was producing a consistent error that had gone unnoticed for 2 years. She had also, without making an announcement of it, begun keeping a correspondence with several of the other ranch families in the surrounding valley, building the kind of network that isolated homesteads tend to lack, and that makes the difference in hard seasons between the communities that survive them and communities that do not. Cole had watched this happen the way you watch something grow when you have planted it in good soil and left it to find its own direction. You do not direct growth. You provide the conditions and you pay attention and you do not get in the way. He told her what Barton had said in full that evening, and she received it with the slight compression of her lips that was her version of being moved by something and not wanting to make a production of it. The separate proceeding against Forsyth concluded 6 weeks later without fanfare. He faced criminal charges for the deliberate sabotage of the stagecoach and for the forged documents. He had lawyers enough to avoid the worst of it, but not enough to avoid all of it. By the time the proceedings were finished, he had sold the eastern spread and left Chaffee County for somewhere neither Cole nor anyone in Salida ever confirmed. Barton said only that a man like that carries his punishment with him wherever he goes, which is the nature of men who have built everything on what they can take from others. Cole did not disagree. Summer came to Salida with the particular generosity of a Colorado high country summer, which is to say briefly and intensely, and with wildflowers that last approximately long enough to make you believe they are permanent before they become the next thing. The eastern pasture, which was still theirs, filled with June grass that came to Thunder's Belly. The creek ran full and cold from the snowmelt. Tommy spent every available hour outdoors on horseback or on foot, ranging the property with the proprietary knowledge of a boy who has grown up on this land and intends to spend the rest of his life improving his understanding of it. Eleanor learned to ride. She was not naturally gifted at it, and she did not pretend to be, but she approached it as she approached everything that required new competence, with patience, with careful attention to the technique before the application, and with a refusal to let embarrassment at intermediate failure prevent eventual success. By July, she was competent. By August, she was capable. Cole did not tell her she was a natural because she was not, and they had an arrangement about honesty. He told her she was good, and he meant it, and she heard the difference. In the first week of July, when they had been married 5 months, and the summer was at its height, Eleanor told him in the morning before breakfast, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the early light on the mountains that she was pregnant. She said it straightforwardly in the manner of someone reporting a fact that is also a feeling that is also a question, and then she turned from the window and looked at him to see how he received it. Cole was sitting at the table with his coffee cup between his hands, and he sat there for a moment without speaking, looking at her. The morning light was behind her, and the kitchen was warm, and she was wearing the gray-blue pioneer dress that she still wore for household work, because she had an attachment to it that she had explained to him once in a way that he understood completely. It was the dress she had worn through the worst of it, and it had come through. And things that have come through the worst with you deserve to be kept and used rather than put away. January, he said, because he was calculating. Dr. Price thinks so, around the new year. He stood up from the table and came to her and stood in front of her, and for a moment he just looked at her face in the morning light, at the particular steadiness of her, the composure that was not distance but presence, the quality he had read in her letters and found in the months since to be as consistently real as anything he had ever encountered in a person. He put his hand against her face and she leaned into it slightly, just slightly, in the particular way of a woman who does not lean easily, and so when she does, it means something. Good, he said. That is very good. She put her hand over his and held it there. Tommy received the news that evening with the gravity appropriate to the occasion, and the list he began making of names that same night on the back of a page of arithmetic was found by Eleanor 2 days later and featured 17 entries, several of which she could not identify as names in any language she was familiar with. She kept the list. She intended to keep it for a long time. The summer unfolded and the fall came after it, cold and clean and bright in the way that Colorado falls are bright, as if the air has been clarified by something. Eleanor worked the ranch alongside Cole and ran her correspondence and did her accounts, and in the evenings read by the fire, and the house had by this time become exactly what Cole had once imagined houses could be when he built the extra rooms into it 10 years ago, and had not known yet what he was building them for. He watched her in those months with the attention of a man who knows he is looking at something he does not want to take for granted. He watched her with Tommy, the relationship that had built itself at its own pace into something that was neither what Tommy had lost, nor a replacement for it, but its own specific thing, a trust earned and a warmth that was real and unglamorous and daily, which is the only kind that lasts. He watched her with Agnes and Henry and the other families of the valley, the way she moved through the community, with a practical generosity that asked nothing in return and that produced without strategy the kind of goodwill that no amount of calculation could manufacture. He watched her and he thought about the letter in his breast pocket and the January blizzard and the moment on the courthouse steps when Tommy had put his hand in hers, and he understood with the full weight of a man who has lived enough to know the difference between a thing that is true and a thing that only looks true, that the best thing he had ever done was get on a horse and ride east. The nights grew longer and the cold deepened, and Eleanor moved through the last months of her pregnancy with the matter-of-fact attitude she brought to most things that were difficult but necessary, which was to continue doing what needed to be done while accommodating the new requirements as they arose. She did not complain. She adapted. Cole watched and helped and said less than he was thinking, because some of what he was thinking was fear, and he knew the shape of this fear well enough to understand that speaking it would not diminish it. He had been away when Maggie got sick. He had come home to something he could not undo. He had carried this for 5 years in the particular way that men carry things they cannot put down, which is to learn to move around them without removing them, to arrange the furniture of daily life so that the weight is distributed as evenly as possible. The fear that arose in the final months of Eleanor's pregnancy was a different shape from anything he had felt before, because the potential loss was different in shape. It was not the grief of what had already been given. It was the grief of what had not yet happened, which is in some ways the sharper of the two, because imagination has no limits that experience has. He said none of this. He made sure the house was warm and the medical supplies were current, and Dr. Price had been consulted and Agnes had been informed, and everything that could be prepared was prepared. He did what he could with his hands and his presence, which was what he had always done, and he waited. Tommy found him on the porch one evening in November, sitting in the cold with no particular purpose, which was not a thing Cole did. The boy sat down beside him without being invited in the way he did things now with Eleanor. the way of someone who had learned that this family did not require invitation for the simple act of presence. "You are thinking about when Mother died," Tommy said. Cole looked at his son. "Yes. Mrs. Whitfield is not sick." "No, she is not." "You went and got her in time," Tommy said. "This time you were there." He paused, looking out at the dark where the cattle were settled and the mountains were invisible behind the cloud cover. "I think that is important, that you were there." Cole was quiet for a long time. "She is not the kind of person who stops," Tommy said. He was using Eleanor's own words from the letter from the phrase that had been in circulation in the Whitfield household long enough now to have taken on the status of a fixed point, a thing everybody in the house knew was true. "She told me that herself, and I believe her." Cole put his arm around his son's shoulders, and Tommy leaned against him in the easy way of a boy who has reached the age where he pretends not to need this, but does not actually pretend very hard. They sat on the porch in the cold together until it was time to go in. James Whitfield arrived on the 2nd of January, 1885, in the small hours of a night that was cold and clear outside and warm with lamplight inside and Dr. Price and Agnes Greer were both present, and Cole sat outside the closed bedroom door for 4 hours, listening to the sounds of what was happening on the other side of it, with the focused attention of a man trying to read a language he does not speak. Once through the door, he heard Eleanor say clearly and calmly in the voice she used when she was addressing something directly rather than around its edges. "Agnes, if something goes wrong, make sure Cole knows I have no regrets about any of it." Agnes said with the asperity of a woman who has heard too many people preparing for outcomes that were not going to materialize. "Nothing is going wrong. You are going to stop talking about things going wrong and focus on what is happening." There was a pause, and then Eleanor said, "You are right, I apologize." Agnes said, "You can apologize later. Breathe now." Tommy, who had been asleep until the house went to a different kind of awake, and who had come downstairs and taken up a position on the steps, 3 steps above the floor, sat with Cole and did not speak for most of those hours. And Cole was grateful for the company in the way he was often grateful for Tommy, for the steady quality of the boy's presence, for the fact that he had learned how to be beside someone without requiring anything of them. At some point, Tommy said quietly, "She is not going to stop." Cole looked at his son. "She told me once," Tommy said, "that the most important thing about a person is whether they quit when it gets hard. She does not quit." He paused. "She will be all right when Dr. Price opened the bedroom door and looked at Cole with the expression of a man delivering the result of something that had gone correctly. Cole stood up from the wall he had been leaning against and walked into the room, with the deliberateness of someone who is aware that this is a moment he will remember in specific detail for the rest of his life. Eleanor was propped against the headboard pillows with the exhausted present stillness of someone who has come through something hard and arrived intact on the other side. Her hair was damp against her forehead, and her face had the particular quality of someone stripped down to their most essential self by effort, and she had never looked more like Eleanor Hartwell than she did at this moment, which is to say, she had never looked more real. She was holding a bundle that made sounds. James Whitfield was red and small and expressed his feelings about the world with great energy. And Cole stood at the bedside and looked down at him and felt something he had no adequate word for, a combination of recognition and wonder, and the particular joy that comes when something you hoped for turns out to be as real as the hoping. "He looks like you," Eleanor said. Cole looked at the child's face. "He looks like himself." Eleanor looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "he does." Tommy appeared in the doorway, having come down the remaining steps at a speed that was below running, but only slightly, and stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at the bundle in Eleanor's arms, with the expression of someone encountering a thing that is smaller than expected and more significant than the size would suggest. "Tommy," Eleanor said, "come meet your brother." Tommy crossed the room. He stood beside the bed and he looked down at James for a long time without speaking, in the thorough way he looked at everything important. "He is very small," Tommy said at last. "He will get bigger," Cole said. "I know." Tommy looked at Eleanor, then at the baby, then at his father. "I am going to teach him everything," he said in the matter-of-fact way of someone for whom this is not a sentiment, but a plan. "I expect you will," Eleanor said. On the 5th of January, 1885, which was the anniversary of the day Cole had found Eleanor in the snow, they rode out together to the line shack. Cole had suggested it, and Eleanor had agreed without the need for explanation, because by this point they knew each other well enough that some things did not require the labor of words. James was at the ranch with Agnes, who had arrived in the morning with a peon and an expression that made it clear she had not been asked because she had volunteered. Tommy rode alongside on his own horse included in the outing, in the way he was included in most things, not as a concession, but as a member. The shack was smaller than Eleanor remembered. She said so as they tied the horses, and Cole said that the snow had been taller than the walls last time, which changed the proportions of a building considerably. This was true, but it was not the whole explanation. The whole explanation was that the mind tends to make the locations of significant events larger than they are, as if the size of what happened there ought to be reflected in the size of the space that held it. Cole built a fire in the small stove not for warmth because the January day was clear and manageable, but because Eleanor was right that the place required it, that certain rooms are not themselves without the particular quality of light and heat that fire provides. They sat in the doorway on the step where the sun came in from the south. Tommy had gone exploring the creek bed 30 yards away, turning over rocks with the systematic interest of someone cataloging the natural world. His voice came to them occasionally when he found something worth reporting. "Are you afraid of anything now?" Eleanor asked. She was looking out at the snow-covered meadow where the winter grasses stood in pale clusters above the white. "Different things," Cole said. He thought about it honestly, which was how he thought about things she asked him directly. "Afraid of not having enough time. Afraid of the things I have not said yet." She looked at him. "Then say them." He looked at her in the winter light at the gray-blue dress that had been through more with them than any piece of clothing had a right to, at the face that he had been reading for a year now, and that still surprised him regularly, which he had come to understand was not a sign of opacity, but of depth. "I fell in love with you in the third letter," he said. "The one where you listed everything you could not do before you listed what you could. I had never read anything that honest before from someone I had never met." He paused. "I have never stopped since." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone thinking about how to respond, but the silence of someone receiving something and letting it settle properly before speaking. "I fell in love with you in the fourth letter," she said. "The one about Tommy and the bracelet. You did not ask me to care about that. You just told me because you thought I should know, because you were trusting me with the real shape of your life before you knew if I was worth trusting with it." She looked at him. "That was the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me." He reached across and took her hand. She held it in both of hers. They sat together in the doorway of the small shack where a year ago he had wrapped her in blankets, and she had told him she was more afraid of him than of dying, and the fire behind them put its warmth into the cold air around them, and Tommy's voice came across the meadow, reporting the discovery of a frozen pond of some significant size. After a while, Cole said, "We should do this every year." "We should," Eleanor agreed. "Come back here." "Yes. Remember where it started." She looked at him. "Is this where it started, or did it start in the letters?" He thought about this. The letters were the beginning. This was where it became real. "Then yes," Eleanor said. "We should come back every year, to where it became real." Tommy came back from the creek with cold, reddened cheeks and the particular satisfaction of a boy who has covered ground and found it interesting, and they rode home in the late afternoon light that turned the snow on the mountains from white to the color of old honey, and the ranch came into view around the last bend of the trail with its windows bright from Agnes's lamplight, and Eleanor looked at it from the saddle the way you look at something that is yours, not with the pride of ownership, but with the simple recognition of belonging. That evening, after James was fed and Tommy was in bed and the ranch house had settled into its night sounds, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and a piece of writing paper and composed a letter. It was addressed to a Miss Rebecca Armstrong of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in response to an advertisement for a teaching position at the informal school that Eleanor had been organizing in the Valley Informal Lessons for the children of the scattered homesteads, whose distance from Salida made regular schooling impractical. Rebecca Armstrong was 24 years old and had written to inquire about the position in a letter that Henry Crawford, who had placed the advertisement in a Philadelphia paper at Eleanor's request, had brought to the ranch with an expression that suggested he found the inquiry notable for reasons he could not entirely articulate. Eleanor had read it twice. Then she had set it down and looked at Cole across the kitchen table with a very particular expression. He had looked back at her. She says she is looking for a life with meaning in the West, Eleanor said. I see that. She says she is not afraid of hard work. Hmm. She says she is a quick learner and does not quit. A pause. Eleanor, Cole said. I know, she said. I know. She had written back the same day a letter of welcome and practical information about the valley and the work and what the West required of a person who came to it seriously. She had written about the community and the families and the landscape and what the winters were like and what the springs were like after them. She had written it with the particular care of someone who knows what it is to read a letter in a small, rented room far from home and to be looking in the lines of it for an honest account of a life worth choosing. At the bottom of the page in the last paragraph she wrote, "The work here is real and the winters are serious and there is no library within convenient distance. But if you come prepared for what it is rather than what you imagine, you will find that the place and the people in it tend to be worth the effort. If your stagecoach is ever delayed, someone will come and find you. That is the kind of country this is." She folded the letter and addressed it and set it on the corner of the table to go with the morning mail. Cole, reading over her shoulder because she permitted this now without comment, looked at the last paragraph and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You did not tell her about the stagecoach." "She does not need to know the specifics," Eleanor said. "She needs to know the principle." He looked at the letter for another moment. Then he said, "That is a good principle." "I know," Eleanor Whitfield said. "It kept me alive." And she put out the lamp and they went to bed, and outside the Colorado night settled over the ranch with its full weight of stars and cold, and the particular permanence of mountains that have been standing long before any of the small human stories happening at their feet, and will stand long after indifferent and magnificent, while down below in the warm rooms of a house built by a man's hands on land he had chosen and claimed and held, the fire banked itself against the night, and the people inside it slept.